Welcome to the Leading Past Limits podcast. We share lessons learned from the hard-won experience of mission-driven professionals to inspire and expand your growth as a servant leader. I'm Kumar Kibble, a leadership coach and the principal at GuideQuest. I've been passionate about developing leaders since graduating from West Point more than 30 years ago. Join us in this episode as we learn from the experiences of Paul Lockhart, a former Air Force test pilot and astronaut. Share in his journey and growth as an astronaut. Hear about the successes and the tragedies of NASA spaceflight and the future of space exploration. Be sure to subscribe and don't miss out on lessons learned from the real-world School of Hard Knocks. Our guest today is retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Paul Lockhart. He is an aerospace engineer and served as an F-16 test pilot, NASA astronaut, and a veteran of 2 space shuttle missions. Over the course of his career, he logged over 5,000 hours in more than 30 different aircraft and spent almost 1 month in space during 2 separate missions. He is currently engaged in technology development for Army Special Operations through his wife's company and is currently writing a book to encourage young people to build character and strive for greatness. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kumar. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
So let's begin with, what motivated you to become an astronaut?
Oh, that story goes back a ways, doesn't it? It goes back to the 1960s when the first astronauts were flying. And of course, for the young folks that are listening, they'll find this probably ancient, but there were only 3 television stations. And anytime there was a space flight, those channels carried the missions. And so as a young boy growing up in West Texas, that 15 minutes of the launch and the ascent, surrounded by all of the television interviews and the whole, the circumstance of all of the viewers out watching the launches and so forth, that was just absolutely captivating. It had everything that a young boy would want. It had the adventure part. It had a little bit of the danger, the little suspense. It had guys wearing really neat flight suits and things of this nature. And so when I was a young boy growing out, like I said, out in West Texas, it was either be a cowboy or an astronaut. And so I chose to be the astronaut first.
So, it's interesting as you describe all that. I remember when I was a small kid, I would sit in I had a chair that I could rock back in my room, and I'd put on a motorcycle helmet and I'd stick a ruler between the cushion and the armchair and just pretend I was flying a spacecraft. But when I learned just how competitive it is to become an astronaut, I have to say I was kind of discouraged. I mean, what are the odds of actually being successfully selected, when you go through the process?
Well, you're right, Kumar. It's a very small select group that make it to train as an astronaut, and even less that fly. When I was selected in 1996, there were 10,000 pilots that applied, and there were 10 that were picked up. And I think it's even broader now with the entire interest in space that's been generated by our commercial spaceflight programs like SpaceX and Blue Origins and stuff. So it's even more difficult now. But I think NASA really does an excellent job of finding the people that will serve our nation's space program well. And probably the character trait that brings these people to NASA's attention is the perseverance and the patience, right? It's a long road to get there. And so you have to really want it.
Yeah, as I recall, when I was kind of reading about your career, was it like 13 years from the time you were commissioned to actually, or maybe more than that? How many years before you actually were selected by NASA?
Well, I was commissioned in 1981 and picked up by NASA in 1996, 15 years. And I always like to, when I talk to young adults and so forth, I say, and guess what? On my first attempt to NASA, I was not selected. Right. So it was a test. And I think NASA does that many times because they really want to see whether you're really interested and willing to go the final mile to be picked up by an astronaut. So, so I did what I had to do after that first denial. And I was very fortunate to be picked up, as I said, in Group 16, the 16th group of astronauts in 1996.
So what did you have to do? How did you cope with that setback?
Now, that's one of the first lessons that I like to tell my two young daughters about life. So it's not about how things come to you easy. It's what happens when you don't get what you want, and it's something that is so important to you that you're willing to do whatever it takes. So some short amount of time after I got the rejection letter, I got in my car, made a call uh, to the chief of the selection office at NASA. And he says, well, if you want, maybe you can drive down here and we can talk. And I said, I'll be there tomorrow. So I
Hmm.
drove through the night, made it there the next morning in a suit and tie. And we sat down and went through my records. And he said, you're awfully close. There's just a little bit more you need. You need to become an instructor pilot. And I said, well, I'm already one now. So that kind of set me up. And on the next selection board, not about a year later, I was picked up in that, as I said, group 16.
Yeah, yeah. What you mentioned perseverance, tenacity. What other qualities are they looking for when they're looking to select astronauts?
So the first set of astronauts, of course, came from the military, and they were all test pilots. And that's because space flight was and is still very difficult. But back then, of course, we were at the beginning of basically the whole use of rockets and missiles to get not only people but payloads into space. And so you needed people that could handle difficult situations in a calm manner. And those people that could assess the situation, maintain situational control, much like we all learned in our various disciplines, whether you come as you did from West Point and so forth, but then could make the right decisions. And then as the program matured and they went from flying a single astronaut in a single rocket to where you had two people in the Gemini program and then three people in the Apollo program, that one, of course, going to the moon, other factors became involved. You needed to have the ability to learn many different types of disciplines and systems. So navigation in space. Then you had to learn rendezvous. So you had to understand those concepts and you had to bring those with you to the game. And then it became important that you could work together as a team. If you're in a small spacecraft for a small amount of time, there are many chances that things you could do, should you not be able to come together and find cohesion in a group, could splinter the team. And so NASA really looks for people that are very flexible and adaptable.
Hmm.
So those are most of the qualities. Nowadays, I would say as space flight, even though it's still very difficult and I think risky, as it gets to be more automated and things of this nature, I think the ability to learn significant amounts of technical material is still important. But as we start planning for the long duration space missions, that emotional aspect is going to be just as important. Can I work with
Yeah.
a team for the amount of months it takes to go to the moon, or for the Mars missions that could be upwards of 2 years to get there, some time on Mars, and then 2 years travel home. That requires some unique skills to work with a small group of people in a small enclosed space for a long period of time.
And I've got to believe that. I mean, trust has just got to be central. When you're risking so much in that kind of an environment. How do you build trust? How does the program? How does your training? How do you reinforce trust among a crew?
So NASA's very good at that. I think the trust isn't what they're driving towards. They're really driving towards competency. And
Yeah.
that competency, when I flew the space shuttle, was the ability to make sure that the ascent part of the mission, 8.5 minutes to go from zero velocity to orbital speed, and then the return, the 40 minutes from orbital velocity to landing on a runway, that we could handle any situation within the limits of what could be expected. And could we do so to an ability that would maximize the crew's chance of survival or bringing the vehicle back home? But what you found in all of the exercises that NASA presented to us in the motion-based simulators, these were the ones that would rotate and move and actually simulate ascent, through the fixed-based simulations where you would do on-orbit types of activities. So you would practice this. then through the neutral buoyancy chamber where you would practice your spacewalks, and then the astronaut who helped support them from inside the space shuttle or the space station would help them execute those spacewalks. What you found out is that trust was built when you yourself and then the collective membership came every day to the job having prepared themselves, having known exactly what was required of them, and then knew not only their jobs, but were willing to learn some of the other requirements as well. And so you really learned really quickly, who you could trust in each situation. And the best teams, of course, had just the highest level of trust across all the team members.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of things that just struck. You talked about managing the ascent.
Correct.
And you talked about, not your words, but what struck me was kind of bringing a calming influence to stressful situations, right? And being able to manage and operate within that. I've wondered this for years. What emotions do you experience as you are sitting on the launch pad?
Yeah.
And how do you manage them?
Well, that's a really good question. So for myself, the military training I had, I think prepared me very well for that, having flown fighter aircraft and then test missions for a long time, prepared me for knowing that I would need to react quickly if things were to go a certain direction. And I knew that all the training that NASA prepared for us and had put us through gave me the skills to handle all of that. So when the crew is on the pad for launch, and for the shuttle, this could be anywhere from 2.5 to 3 hours after having ingressed the vehicle, and then having prepared the space shuttle to go from just being a vehicle kept working by all of the external power and communications requirements to a vehicle that almost in a sense comes alive before launch, right? You go internally on power, you go internally on communications and guidance and navigation. You start to have this, for myself, a little bit of a surreal experience. This time, especially on my first mission, this one's for real. So all of this training, these multiple simulations, these multiple scenarios where you practice all of this, and to include the ones where you should have launched that day, but something occurred, for example, weather, that doesn't let you launch, so you have to step back. Well, on the time that you really launched, it starts to become this almost surreal situation. You know, there's no one around you on the launch pad at this time, and you see the countdown clock inside the cockpit ticking down. And after you've done all you can for launch, you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, this one's really going to happen. There's not much I can do about it, so I might as well be prepared to go. And so it's almost a calming influence.
Does fear ever enter in at any point?
No, I don't think so. The crews are trained to including all of those that came to NASA and didn't come from military flight backgrounds. NASA does an extremely good job of finding people that can adapt well. And so never did fear find itself into any of the flight decks or anything. There might be apprehension if something happens that's unexpected, but as is always the case, the crew would break down into what their main functions were, the commander or the pilot or the mission specialist, and they would apply all of their knowledge to solve the problem. For example, on my second mission, we had on ascent a potential fuel tank leak in one of the systems, and I was surprised when the ground control called it up and said, we see a potential leak, how quickly I and mission specialist number 2 started right into the procedures, just as if we'd been in simulation. So I was really pleased that that the human body, in other words, almost the human mind, can really switch from absorbing all sorts of things that are going around to, when necessary, it can focus down on those things that are important.
During my leadership program, I focus on the Apollo 13 mission. And we talk about, the innovation that was required in terms of moving from one module to the next because the life support systems were compromised in the one. It was just really interesting to see not only obviously the adaptation that was going on in the in the space vehicle, but all of the testing and innovation that was going on the ground, right? I mean, just amazing, yeah, to think about how to solve that problem when they're 200,000 miles away from home.
Well, I think part of that comes from the American spirit, is one. Part of that comes from NASA's basic thinking process, which is we're part of part of America's innovation culture, and then part of that is driven by spaceflight of itself. Unlike many different types of experiences or efforts, spaceflight requires the problem to be solved internally. There isn't, for example, a warehouse to go get a spare avionics package, right? There isn't, for example, a hardware store where I can go get those pieces or whatever. And so NASA was really, I think, focused on and helped us train to look at a problem broadly and then apply many of the procedures that they had already thought out, but they had trained us as well. Well, if these aren't solving the problems, innovate and solve in what you feel best. And I could see that in many of my crewmates.
What what most excited you about serving as an astronaut?
Well, that is an evolving deep answer inside of who I am, I think. So as a young person, that began as, wow, what an adventure this is, how exciting this is, how interesting to be with these really smart and very capable people. And my gosh, I get to be with these others. I always felt like all my other peers are, wow, they're just really special. So they have some of them 3 degrees and they can do so many things. But then as I progressed through flight number 1 and then flight number 2, and then as I had the chance to represent the United States and NASA in various other situations, even after I had left NASA, I think the answer lies with the deep satisfaction in having known that I did my best for the United States at a critical time. In other words, I met the challenge. All of these people represented by NASA had put their faith in me to do the right thing at the right time, and I rose to that challenge. And so I think that's what I live with most, is that I can speak to groups and say, hey, thank you, meaning your parents, your grandparents, if I'm talking to young people, thank you for the opportunity to have served like this. And I'm just honored that we were able to do what we were supposed to do.
Well, I think one of the things that strikes me, though, Paul, is that certainly being an astronaut has given you a platform, and yet you've used that platform consistently to shine a light on service, to encourage young people. We talked about you writing the adventure book.
Yes.
And I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, selfless service is such a core principle. In fact, it might even be one of the named principles in the U.S. Air Force, as I remember.
Integrity, excellence, and service before self. You're exactly right. But those are all wrapped up, much like those from the United States Military and Academy. It belongs to those men and women in the U.S. military who serve and what they do. And I think what's most interesting about that is, we serve our nation, but we serve the Constitution. And, the Constitution is that one document that binds all of us together from past through present and into the future.
Yeah. Well, I asked you what most excited you. What most frustrated you?
No, that I didn't get to do the Hubble mission. So that sounds somewhat strange, but, I got to build the International Space Station, but sitting out there was this really great mission to go to the Hubble telescope and have an opportunity to repair the Hubble and continue its work looking deep into space. And boy, there were some really capable guys and gals that were already lined up to fly that mission. And so I knew I wasn't going to break into that line. So I just kind of said, oh well, that won't be, but I'll do the best I can and the other parts that NASA assigns me to. So probably that. Also one other thing within my aviation career that you always feel frustrated at is, with every wonderful thing that comes, there's not always the yang per se, but there's always, if you start down this path, you can't do this path. And so I recall the day that I was picked up to go to test pilot school, which of course gave me the opportunity to go to NASA, but that was also just before my squadron entered into Operation Desert Storm. And so I had to leave my squadron right on the eve of that, within weeks of their deployment to their location and then participation in Operation Desert Storm. And so that's one of those things that I wish that I could have continued all the way through, but it just wasn't to be.
Right. But so you missed on that. You didn't get to do Hubble.
No.
But you were a part of building the International Space Station, right? I mean,
yeah. When you think
in those missions,
yes. So the International Space Station has to, I think, be placed in the same level of engineering feats as, they say, the Panama Canal or the pyramids from back 3,000 years ago. It was just a remarkable planning and production and the construction of a structure in space that we're still using to date. I always tell everybody that none of this was tested on the ground. It wasn't as if we had all of the parts and pieces and we sat around a table and we could say, okay, everything's here, all the bolts fit, the holes are lined up for everything. It basically was, we build it to tolerances and then we're going to launch it into space and then we're going to see if it all fits. And so I was really concerned, not specifically for myself, but I was concerned that I would get up there and then the pieces and parts that we had brought up, that they may not match exactly, but they all did to a T. And I was just really struck at how well the space station was built. And that's a testament to the thousands of hours put in by the NASA government personnel and all of their contractors and all of the small businesses that supported our nation's space program in the 90s and into the early 2000s.
Yeah. When we talk about the ISS, another thing I've wondered about, so when you're in the cupola, and I've heard you describe it in the past as kind of like a bay window, giving you this expansive view of the Earth. How does that move you in terms of a sense of awe or spirituality, or how does that make you feel?
So you strike it right at the heart there, Kumar, and thank you for asking me this question. At the heart of what was the most moving part of my mission up there. Sure, we built the space station, and sure, we did, over my 2 missions, 6 spacewalks that were extremely successful. And sure, we did all of the other small experiments that they requested us to do. All of that pales in comparison to that visual view one has when they look out the window or cupola of the space station for the first time, and one sees this blackness of space, total black, a few stars that are there, that they're no closer, but they just don't twinkle. The moon is there, perhaps, if it's in a position where you can see it, and it's a little clear, but it's really not too much closer because the shuttle and the space station aren't that high. And the sun is bright when it comes up over the horizon because the light's not diffused by the Earth's atmosphere. All of that pales in comparison to that beautiful palette of colors, which are the Earth when you look down upon it as it's kind of set against this velvet black. The blues, the oranges, the greens, the different shades of greens, the browns, and then the dynamic aspect of the Earth. It's not a static piece of our universe. It's constantly changing as you look down. The hundreds of miles long dust storms that I saw in Southwest Asia, the thunderstorms at night over the tropical part of Africa with thunderstorms so big that the lightning was erupting at probably 5 per second. So in other words, it looked like popcorn down below. The ocean currents, and then of course the cloud formations. All of this makes for a very dynamic Earth. And I came away with that with one word that I use to describe the Earth's view from up there, and that's majestic. I think that encaptures everything about where our Earth is in relationship to the universe and why it's so special. And for me personally, I look at the Earth and, it's so set apart and so special from within our solar system, at least, from everything else, that you in my mind, that there is a guiding hand somewhere behind all of that. And so it reinforced in me that I'm really just a small part of what's going on in the universe, and we humans are as well.
Right. Oh, that's a beautiful image.
Thank you.
Another thing I've wondered about, especially as I kind of look at, you mentioned Gemini, Mercury, Apollo, and you brought up SpaceX. How is the NASA of the 1960s, for example, different from the NASA of today?
Well, in many ways, it's not. It has a core set of functions. In other words, NASA has 10 centers. So you have NASA broadly, the agency, and then there's 10 NASA centers, and each of them focus on their own special skill and expertise. So, for example, Johnson Space Center in Houston is where astronauts train, and you also do work for long duration missions and rendezvous. And then Kennedy Space Center is where the astronauts launch. And then you have Glenn Research Center in Ohio, which has expertise in thermodynamics and also in other aspects of spaceflight. And there's 7 more after that. And so the NASA of then and today, the number of centers have changed a little bit, but it's still that same disparate group of organizations working, not just doing space, but also aerospace and aviation for our nation, because that's the charter of NASA, is not just space, but also aerospace. In terms of spaceflight, I think NASA does a very good job of thinking of the very large missions. Perhaps the difference between now and then is we're much more mature in the robotic space programs as previously, right? So as you just probably know, Perseverance just landed on Mars, and now we just have the first little drone that flew there. And that takes a long time to develop. So in the 50s and 60s, when we just started the nation space program, the emphasis was on the human space flight. The robotic programs were there, but they were very simple. And over the decades, they've grown much more complex. So looking back on the question that you'd ask, I would say NASA today is very mature and skilled in developing the robotic space programs. And we're inching along on the human space flight of it, right? The rockets are basically the same concept, because we used to have, for example, the Saturn V rockets had the astronauts in a capsule on the top. Then we moved into the space shuttle program, where the astronauts sat in a winged vehicle that flew back down. And now we're moving back to the Space Launch System, which has a capsule on the top again. And part of that is because we found out how hard it is to fly a winged vehicle back through space. So that's how I would compare the NASA to the NASA of today. The robotic side, the deep space exploration is more mature. Our understanding of the Earth and our space program on the human-rated side has its progression has been a little bit more haphazard. Start, stop, start. And we're just now starting to lay the groundwork for the rockets and the capabilities that'll take us back to the moon and Mars in the future.
You know, as a layperson, though, from the outside, when I look and I think, man, I mean, in the 1960s, I mean, Kennedy says, but some may ask, why the moon? And, and then what, 10 years later, or less than that,
Yeah.
we've got men on the moon. That's so audacious, so bold. I mean, that's the phrase, right? What's your moonshot?
Sure.
And then, as I understand it, Nixon comes in, or maybe there's the politics of the situation affect the funding or the commitment to that kind of investment. So I've got to imagine then that NASA does have to innovate or change course or think in different ways about how they provide value to the country. I mean, could you comment a little bit about that?
Sure, I can. NASA always receives bipartisan support across all administrations, which is a good thing. But its budget really is pretty small for the mission that broadly that it's given by Congress. And Congress is, of course, selected by us. So it's really the mission that we, the citizens of the U.S., give NASA. And NASA has always attempted to be bold. It has a history of being bold and being successful, but it's got a very difficult mission, a very difficult assignment to do. And because of that, it occasionally, if you may say the right word, it ruptures on the side in terms of being able to handle all of the complexity of its missions with a budget that may not exactly fit what it needs, if that makes sense. So were NASA's budget, I think, matched to what Congress and others wished it to do, would be much broader, and they would be able to move faster in achieving some of the goals that they've set. But I think NASA tries to do the best it can and does so within the budget that it has. But over the course of 50 years, you can see where NASA's budget has leaned out or grown a bit. Mostly it stays pretty stable. And their successes have come in fits and starts, as we described earlier with the human space program. With, unfortunately, there's been some tragic accidents that have occurred over the course of these decades. And one of them is the reason why you and I are speaking now, Kumar, because of the loss of Columbia just after my mission.
Mm-hmm. So you were in the program during then, right?
Yes.
I mean, how did that impact you?
Well, so it was a life-altering event for us. I had the last mission before Columbia on STS-113, and my crew and I were down, and we're doing public relations events, going around and thanking all the people in NASA for their support, for their hard work. When STS-107 launched in January of 2003, and that mission was not a space station building flight. It was a space sciences mission, and on that mission was the commander, Rick Husband. He and I actually grew up together in the same hometown, and so we had known each other for the longest time. In college, we had sat in his living room and discussed going to the Air Force so that perhaps we could go to NASA someday. So that mission was of interest to me because my good close friend Rick was on there. And then 3 of my classmates from the group of 16 were on that mission. When we lost Columbia on February 1st, 2003, I knew that NASA would not fly for a while because they would have to step back and understand exactly what had happened, and then how do they establish a set of protocols, procedures, and processes such that on any other further mission they could deal with the loss of deal with the situation that had caused Columbia. And I also knew that since I had flown twice within a few months, which is a very unusual circumstance, that I was probably back to the selection order. In other words, I would fly next as a commander, but it was going to be a while before we would fly for those 2 reasons. So when Operation Iraqi Freedom kicked off in 2003, I was, as you recall, I said that I had been wistful about not being there for Desert Storm. Here again was a situation where I felt like, well, my nation's, and especially the Air Force, they're engaged again, and I'm not being part of that. I knew that I wasn't going to do anything special like fly combat or anything of that nature, but I really wanted to do something and get engaged. So I spoke to my wife, and she and I decided, well, let's go back blue. Let's go back Air Force. It was a hard decision, Kumar, to leave NASA at the time. You never know what's going to happen, but it's turned out very well. We're now here where we are and have had many chances to do some really exciting things, to include being with yourself.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Of course.
I like the way you said, though, in the before we began the interview, you were commenting on being kind of at the top of the pyramid with this massive support infrastructure enabling you, and now you still serve. You still serve in a different capacity, supporting our special operators and through innovative technologies and sensors and so on. So, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. But
Sure.
I'd like to stay with the theme of innovation. I've heard you in the past describe human exploration. You've kind of compared it to the Lewis and Clark expedition, the core of discovery, and you've kind of made the analogy that we are basically that commenced from St. Louis, and that in terms of human explanation, we're at about St. Louis. so a couple of questions there. I mean, what is important about moving beyond St. Louis, with human exploration? And what do you say to those that emphasize robotics or drones because of a lower, cost or lower risk to life? Love your comments on that.
Sure. Excellent question. So you are right. I have compared it to Lewis and Clark and starting out in St. Louis. Or sometimes when I talk to young people, well, we're really just on our back porch, looking out at the backyard and the woods back there, and we've really got to get back out into those woods and go exploring because we're still just on our back porch. But I think that the United States now has a path where we're going to get off that back porch and start going back out into the woods again here very soon. Or we're, as Lewis and Clark would be doing, they're moving westward out of Missouri. So why is this important? This question has come across with NASA, and those involved in space flight all the time. And there are 1,000 different ways to approach this. But part of the reason why I think it's important is space flight has interwoven into it every part of human endeavor possible. There is not one piece of science, there's not one piece of art, there's not one piece of the human emotion, our human psychology that's not interwoven into space flight in some manner. And every time we enter into a space mission, whether it's robotic or whether it's human-rated space flight, we learn more about ourselves. And I think that in and of itself justifies, because that knowledge we learn about ourselves then is used to make our life better on Earth, whether it's technology-wise or whether it's going to be in the future, for example, for the astronauts that have to travel deep into space to Mars. We learn about the psychology more so of loneliness or having been isolated. And all of this is, can be playing for human society in the future better for things such as the pandemic and those people that have to be isolated for a while. How do you best care for those kind of people? In terms of the robotic space flight and the human-rated space flight, they're two twins. They both have to be active in part of that. And the reason why I think humans have to be there, much like I always think that when you talk about autonomous vehicles in terms of being involved in other aspects of our society, whether it's the economy or the military or whatever, the parts that's missing is the human judgment that you and I bring to a situation. Now, sure, computers can gather data and they can do machine-to-machine learning, and they can do what is called AI, artificial intelligence, to gather a bigger solution set from which computers can build and make selections upon. But that is not an infinite database that they have yet. And so you and I bring, with still the most important computer and impressive computer that has yet to be built, though not by us, but by God, you and I bring the ability to see across a wide variety of situations and experiences to connect dots that are too difficult to do. Even though computers can do things with greater precision and greater speed, you and I still see things off, two things that shouldn't be comparable, and we go, oh, those are connected because back when I was in college, I saw this same thing and I remember that happening. Or talking to other people in flying or driving, and somebody told me about this, and I recall that experience. So I think that both are required. I like to say when I was on orbit and I looked down on this majestic Earth, as I was describing earlier, I could understand why humans lived where they lived when they began civilization and why they migrated this direction. You can just look down and get this view and understand, well, of course, in this area, there are ancient volcanoes in the Sahara Desert, right? And so there's just no water at this point. So you can see why the civilizations would have gone here and then moved this direction. And sometimes it's those pieces of information that the human brings, where you see something and you use a little bit of your oceanography, your little bit of history, your little bit of engineering, your little bit of maybe working on the lawnmower at home. Something comes together and you go, oh, that's what that is. That's so unusual. I need to take that photo because that's something that's not normally seen.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's my call for it, as to why we need to have humans still in there. That little spark of imagination, that judgment that we bring is, I think, very critical.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you think of, when we talk about humans going beyond low Earth orbit, potentially going back to the moon, how does, and this wouldn't just be NASA, it could be also the work you're currently doing with your wife. I mean, what are the essentials for staying at the bleeding edge of innovation? What needs to be in place?
Well, I think, first of all, there has to be the belief that you aren't the leading edge of innovation, right? So for as much as you think you're on the leading edge of innovation, I can tell you from having served on the engineering advisory committee at the University of Texas, which is probably comparable in terms of what other universities are doing too, seeing those young people and the work they're doing in graduate work just tells me that already there's tentacles of knowledge being formed that are far beyond what you think you're doing. And so I think it begins with saying, you're not really at the leading edge of innovation. There's
humility.
Humility is at the key of it. And you need to continue to start looking. Once you get comfortable, as you've heard in many different things, once you get comfortable at what you're doing and thinking that you've got it solved and it's not going to get any better, well, then you're probably peaked and you're on your way down. So innovation requires constant questioning and asking what's out there that's better, and not being complacent in what you're doing, believing that there's better ways of doing something.
Yeah. What about one more question on NASA? The most significant leadership challenge you experienced there? It's a big question, so you might go ahead.
It is. So, and it's a really good one, and I think I have a really good answer. So my most significant leadership question was, how can I be the best follower? So, and it was set up by my two missions that came so close to one another. So as you become a leader, you realize that you have to be a good follower first. You have to support the team and elevate it and do your part so that those that do lead can succeed and focus on what's important. So my two missions had two different commanders and two different leadership styles. And I had spent 1 year training with one, and we had a very successful mission with a certain type of leadership style and a certain style of training based upon the skills of my crew. Fast forward to 3 months later, after I had been told, oh, you're going to fly again in about 6 weeks, which is very unusual, I had to learn another mission with a different crew on the same space shuttle, the Endeavour. And this crew makeup was totally different, with a different type of commander and a different leadership style. And I had to readapt both my how do I support the commander? So I had to change my leadership style internally so that I did the right thing for them. And then I had to adapt my leadership style as the intravehicular astronaut, the one who stays on the inside and helps the two astronauts do their spacewalks. So I'm in charge of the checklist, tracking everything, almost in a sense the ballet conductor, the conductor of the orchestra or the coach on the sidelines. I had to totally change that because the crew in my second mission were very experienced and had flown before. At least one of them had. And my crew on my first mission, they were rookies, both of them. So my training style had to adapt quickly. And I saw that as soon as I started using the same leadership techniques on the first mission to the second one. And the crew pulled me aside and said, hey, we can do this. We need you to do that. So I adapted very quickly. So I think that was a great study in leadership between those two missions.
As you describe that, I'm hearing like a classical definition of emotional intelligence, like adapting to differing personalities and situations and responsibilities and team dynamics. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I love the way you framed it too, being a better follower.
Yeah, well,
that's great.
I was the newbie on the second crew, right? I was the guy that was being brought into this crew that was very mature, about ready to fly, and all of a sudden I'm thrust in there. And so, yeah, you better have emotional intelligence, or they'll show you really quickly, right? They'll show you your place.
Yeah.
But that was a great mission. Both of them were fun. But I really liked mission number 2 because we had a very tough series of spacewalks to do, and it was a hard mission with all the stuff that we were doing, and we exited out of that mission with extremely few mistakes. So I was very proud of that.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to now.
Sure.
What is your passion now?
Oh, I've got several passions. So number 1 is I'm a follower again. I'm supporting my wife. So all those years, when I was on the top of the pyramid, she was doing her bit down here. Now that pyramid is inverted, and she has a company that does support for the Army Special Ops. She builds sensors and satellite antennas, and also big data analytical software to help the Army Special Ops fly unmanned vehicles and do so autonomously. And so my job is to fit in wherever I can and help her. So that's one, right? And that's kind of neat. Here's one on the side. So I've flown 30 different kinds of aircraft, over 5,000 hours. And since I left NASA, it's, 5 new aircraft, things of this nature. Okay, this one's going to be kind of interesting. So, and it's one of those passions since I was a young kid. So I told you, growing up in West Texas, I could either be a cowboy or an astronaut, right? So I chose the astronaut right. First. And what I'm doing now, I'm trying to go back and learn to be the cowboy right now. So I'm learning to work a horse. And to be honest, that's almost as hard as anything I've ever done, right? I don't have the emotional intelligence of the horse yet, but I'm trying my best. Yeah.
What about would you also share a little bit more about, even the genesis of this idea of an adventure book and trying to motivate and inspire young people?
Yes, that goes back to when I was little, and I didn't have any grandparents. They had all passed by the time I was 2 years old. But I had a half aunt that was much older than my mom. So she, in a sense, was my grandmother in a way. And she would come visit us, and she always brought out a book. So here's this story on Lewis and Clark, right? Or here's the story on Daniel Boone, or here's the story on the first person to explore Antarctica, or things of this nature, or books about animals and things of this nature. And so from her, I got this passion for exploring and the qualities that needed to persevere and continue on when things got hard. And then as I got older, I want to make sure I answer your original question. You were wondering about how I got to the book. I realized then that there were people that stepped into my life at the right time. And besides the aunt that I just spoke about, and kind of guided me in the right direction, right? And so I've often thought about how important those adventure books were to me, and how I gained a lot of my perspective about who I am and what I wanted to be from them. And so I've decided that that's something that I want to do is, as I've inverted this pyramid, I want to give back, right? And I want to do so for the youth and emphasize those qualities that I think are necessary in all facets of life, right? You've got to conduct yourself with integrity. You have to be true to yourself first. And you have to have courage to stand up. Each day is a test of courage. Can you do the right thing? Can you try and put out and do the best in whatever you're doing? That all takes courage. As I've grown older, that's almost one of my most favorite words now, courage, because it's something that you have to carry with you, and you're tested each day, generally not by external forces, but by internal, your internal will and your internal emotion and so forth. So
I completely agree. Completely agree. I mean, it's about intestinal fortitude and taking the harder right over the easier wrong and persevering. All of those are elements of courage, of fortitude. Yeah,
you're right.
Not necessarily assaulting a bunker,
No.
or flying a space shuttle.
Well, you are so correct. And I've had a chance to meet many Medal of Honor winners, and of course, none of them said, "Oh yes, I knew this was going to come, and so I knew I'd have the courage to do that." In all of the instances, these men of many different backgrounds and many different nationalities, or they're Americans, but I mean different races and so forth. Each of them basically said, I just dug deep to do what I knew needed to be done to care for my comrades. And I can't think of anything more satisfying in life someday, besides your own relationship with God and then your family, than to know that you can have put yourself in a position to have done all you can for your fellow man, whatever that could be. It could be physical danger, but it could be working in medicine and doing all you can to help. It could be in sports to train young sports athletes. It could be in business to develop a business that really serves the good of all. So there's a lot of ways to go about it. Gee, how did we get from the question to that there, Kumar? That was a good.
We're philosophizing.
We are, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, listen, where can our listeners learn more about you and your current pursuits?
Oh, wow.
Where would you point them to?
Oh, well, thank you, Kumar. I really appreciate that. Gosh, I don't know what to tell you per se. I have a website called Virtus Adventures. Virtus is the Latin word for character, right? Virtue comes from that. So www.virtusadventures.com. And in that, I have written some basic thoughts about events that have happened in my life. The time I almost put myself in a very bad situation with the young airman in the back. And if things hadn't worked out, I wouldn't have been here today. And that was a confession moment to myself and others that I wasn't paying attention, to stories about things that have happened to me when I hiked the jungles of New Guinea, for example, and the things that I saw there. So to me, it's a way for me to give back to the youth, and I'm hoping that these collections of stories will become the book that I try and that I'm working on to bring back and give to the youth.
We're going to have you back to hear about the jungles of New Guinea.
Let me tell you, those Australians, those are great people to be with. I'll tell you. Yeah, I've got good stories for that. We all do, Kumar, and that's the great thing. I'm sure all of your people that are listening, if they'll stop and think, they can just take a walk around their block. And for young kids and boys, it can be an adventure, whatever you make of it.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to share your lessons learned over a highly successful career of risk and sacrifice. Really appreciate it.
Well, Kumar, it's an honor to be with you, and to all of the folks that are part of your story yourself, and to your listeners, I wish them all the best, and may they find the inner courage they need to go out and do what they want to do tomorrow and in the future.
Amen.
Right.